Typically, this is that Sunday when I'm saying something to the effect of, man, I can't believe this next week is going to be, Thanksgiving, and then we start our Christmas series next Sunday. I'm not going to say that this year because it seems like Christmas should have been about 4 months ago. 2020 seems to have lasted about 5 years. And so it's a different year. It's a different type of year that we're in all of a sudden. And it'll be a different type of Thanksgiving for a lot of us, won't it? Just the way that we've planned and the way that we're being advised to minimize, the struggles have been real. The difficulties of this past year have been real. 2020 has been hard, but the reality is that we still have reason for Thanksgiving. The reality is that God's goodness has never changed. Our purpose has never changed. Our hope has never changed. This is real, and it's something that we can bank on, and that's why we've been studying this book of Ruth. That's why we've been looking at that, because Thanksgiving in our lives is about realizing and celebrating God's work even in the middle of difficulty. It's easy to be thankful when everything's going right, isn't it? But when we take time to realize all that God's done for us and in us and through us, that's one of those things that generates a spirit of thanksgiving that changes the way that we live. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about. But like our lives, Ruth it's a complicated story. It's a story of strings getting tied together, and honestly, it's a story of struggle. We look at the major characters, Naomi, whose name means sweetness, but now she says, call me bitter. Hers is a struggle of pain. And honestly, she's struggling with a faith that used to be. A faith that she may have had at one point, but now she's just angry. In Ruth, this scrappy young gal from Moab, who's done nothing but show love to her mother-in-law. Been nothing but be kind to her. And honestly, hers is the struggle of trying to outlive her past and her pedigree, where she's from. Boaz, Mr. Consistent, the one who's always doing the right thing, living for God in the middle of terrible times. He's that picture of a life that's rooted in Scripture and driven by love. That's who he represents. But honestly, his struggle is trying to live in the middle of a very difficult time. Trying to be God's person when everything else seems to be going in a different direction. Oh, and in reality, a lot of us here today and a lot of us online are represented in those stories. Those of us that used to have faith. But life got hard and the pain got real and we've walked away from that. Or those of us who are just starting to explore what does it mean to trust Jesus? What's it mean to be a person of faith? Or the ones of us who have lived by faith for a long time. But honestly, when we look around, it's pretty depressing. You see, we find our stories in this story, and here's why. Because there's nothing new under the sun. The struggles that we feel are the struggles that happened a generation ago and happened 100 years ago and happened, in this case, 3,000 years ago. But there is one more story in here, and that's the story of Yahweh God. And his is the one to be celebrated because he's the one who's always working to the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. He's the one who's always leading people to Jesus. He's the one who's in the middle of difficult circumstances, even though we might not see his hand, just doing what he does. So one more Sunday, we're going to dive back into the book of Ruth, into Ruth chapter 4. One more Sunday, we're going to step back into this narrative and try to see this story again and watch what happens. So let's take just a moment, though, and let's kind of recap what's happened. It starts with a family who's leaving. It's gotten bad in Bethlehem, so they take off. And they go to and there would be the worst possible place you could go. They go to the side of the enemy. They go there to live there and to hope to provide. But even there, honestly, it gets worse. And there's loss, and there's pain, and there's hurt. And Naomi returns with her daughter-in-law, Ruth, broken. Matter of fact, she tries to talk Ruth out of coming. She's like, it's going to be hard for you here. We don't like Moabites. We don't like your kind. This is going to be tough. Go back to your family. Go back to your family's gods. But there they find, as she begins this walk back, they find that God is providing. And even providing for her and her young Moabite daughter-in-law. Oh, and then last week we got into that crazy story of risk. That kind of harebrained scheme that Naomi had that put Ruth into a very, very bad situation, but God was good there as well. You see, this is a story of three different strands. Three different strands of life, three different backgrounds, three different stories, but that are all trusted into the good hands of God. And what he does is he starts to weave a tapestry out of this. And today we're going to see him pull it all together, and we're going to see what he's doing, and we'll see God make something beautiful in the middle of a dark time, in the middle of tragedy, in the middle of difficulty. So Ruth chapter 4, if you would join with me, I'm gonna start in verse 1. Remember, hold on, before we get there, let me remind us. In the middle of that tension, in the middle of that bad situation, what Ruth said, hey, you're our kinsman redeemer. Would you take it? Just so we get this idea, again, kinsman redeemer, there was a law set in place to where if, say, I died and I had a brother, he could marry my wife so that my name wouldn't disappear. It's on my behalf, and if there were children, it would be on my behalf, and so my name would stay in the family line. That was important in their world because businesses, property, all passed through the male descendants. So it's called a kinsman redeemer. And remember, Boaz says, hold on, I'm happy to do that, but there's someone closer. So we have to do things right. We have to follow righteousness. And so we're going to step into the scene here. This is where Boaz starts to make those plans come together. And really, it's not Boaz, but we'll find out it's God making everything come together. So Ruth chapter 4, verse 1, Boaz went to the gate of the town and sat down there. Soon the family redeemer Boaz had spoken about came by. Really, in the Hebrew here, it says, behold. Behold, like, hey, and lo and behold, he shows up. Boaz said, come here and sit down. So he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the town's elders and said, hey, sit here. And they sat down. And he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the territory of Moab, is selling the portion of the field that belongs to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should inform you. Buy it back. In the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do it. But if you don't want to redeem it, tell me so that I will know, because there isn't anyone other than you to redeem it, and I'm next after you. I want to redeem it, he said. In other words, he's saying, hey, Elimelech's gone, Naomi's got to sell the family farm. And he steps in and says, I'll do it. I'll take care of that. Now, let's set the scene here a little bit. I think we have a picture here of this is what an ancient gate would look like. Now, so it's important to get this. Let me get nerdy on you just for a minute. This is a picture I took in Israel, and if you'll see, there are indents. It's called a 6-chamber gate, so there would be 3 indents on each side. And the reason why they did that is the big towns, the big powerful countries, they had what they called Abrams tanks, or really they were chariots. And so when the chariots would come through, since Israel didn't have those, they could put infantrymen, that poke them when they tried to come through with their chariots. So that it was a defensive structure, but in times when there wasn't war going on, this became the place where it's kind of like City Hall. So the elders of the town, they'd go and they'd sit in the gate, and they'd watch who's coming in and who's coming out. Hey, what's going on here? What's going on there? And this became the place. It was a safe place. There weren't allowed to be any violence here. It was a place where if you had a dispute with someone, that it could get worked out. So Boaz gets up early in the morning and he places himself there and he watches, because of anyone who owns a farm, they've got to go out there, and the text says, behold, the implication is, as soon as he got there, well, lo and behold, look who shows up. And behold, remember when you're reading the Hebrew text and it says, behold, it's never a coincidence. God's arranging something. God's putting something together, and he shows up, the kinsman redeemer. And it's interesting. It doesn't name him, and I think that's very specific, because down the road it wouldn't have wanted to insult this man's name because he backs out on his duty. So they call him. It's literally old so and so shows up. Old so-and-so shows up, and Boaz tells him about the situation. Now, make no mistake about it, Boaz is working the problem here. He doesn't mention anything about Ruth up front. He just says, hey, there's a good deal on the land. Elimelech's died. This would be your chance. And the guy says, oh, I'll step in there. The neighbor's property, and technically I'm the kinsman redeemer. I'll take care of that. And then Boaz, though, then takes the next step. Look at verse 5. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, the wife of the deceased man, to perpetuate the man's name on his property. Oh, and by the way, I didn't tell you that this comes with the property you buy. You get the dead guy's widow, is basically what it said. You get Mahlon's wife. And he says, hit the brakes, please. Let's slow down on this process. Slow down here. Because if you think about it, how's that conversation go at home? Just so we're reminded each other, the Moabites were known for sexual perversion, honestly. They were known to be very just wicked folks. As a matter, I think it's Numbers 25 talks about it, where they were seducing Israelite men, and it works out really, really bad. So if you think about this guy, he's already running through the conversation at home. Hey, hon, guess what happened today? I bought a field, and by the way, we've got a new Moabite girl moving into the house. Say what? What are you talking about? And really, we've invested there, but this is going, not only is she going to live here, but we're going to perpetuate Mahlon's family for him. Hit the brakes. He's like, man, there is no way I'm getting involved in this. And he says, I've got to watch out for my own inheritance. In other words, I got to make sure my wife doesn't kill me. I can't get involved here. And he says, you go on ahead and do it. Boaz is a single man. You go on ahead and do. You marry Ruth, the Moabitess. They had a, you notice here in the text it says, now back in those days, it's one of those indicators, this was written later. This was written later, and he says there was a habit of something they did when there was a legal transaction. You take off a shoe and you'd swap it. I got no idea why in the world, what the purpose of that was, but that's how you sealed the deal, is I'd take off one shoe and you'd take off a shoe and we'd swap it and we hoped that we wore the same size shoe. But that's how that happened. Look at verse 9. Because Boaz he's worked this situation together and now he has the legal right to marry Ruth. Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You're my witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion and Mahlon." That was Elimelech's two sons. "I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's wife, as my wife, to perpetuate the deceased man's name on his property, so that his name will not disappear among his relatives or from the gate of his hometown. You're my witnesses today." And all the people who were at the gate, including the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord, may Yahweh make the woman who is entering into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built the house of Israel. May you be powerful in Ephrathah, and your name well known in Bethlehem. May your house become like the house of Perez, whose son, the son Tamar bore to Judah. Because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz steps in and he says, "I'm going to marry her. And folks, you're my witnesses is that." And they respond in a blessing. It's interesting, when righteousness rules, justice is everybody's business. And now it's one of those times where everybody says, "Yes, we're witnesses to this," and they bless him. So let's stop for a minute. And let's talk about Boaz. Boaz, this person who always seems to be, I've said this a number of times, he's the one who, there's not anything bad said about him. He does things according to the way that they should be done. Eugene Peterson uses a term, calls it a long obedience in the same direction. What a cool way to think about that. I hope that someday something like that could be said of me. A long obedience in the same direction. This is what it looks like to be a person of righteousness. And I say that it's important to know because we have a lot of folks in the church who have been Christians a long time. There's folks who have followed Jesus a long time. And if you're that person and you look around at the world and you assume, man, everything seems to be just going to hell in a handbasket. And I don't use that phrase lightly. It seems to be going wrong. Boaz reminds us that God is at work in the darkest of times. That God's plans have never changed. That his goodness has never wavered. That his ability has never faltered. And here we see him working all things to the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. Boaz is the picture of living righteously in the middle of a difficult time. And if he can do that in the time of the judges, hear me on this. If he can do that in the time of the judges, you and I can do it in 2020. If here's a picture, what's it say? The very last verse of the book of Judges is this. In the time of the judges, there was no king in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, everyone did what they wanted to do. You read the heroes in Judges, they're not good guys. You know, we draw pictures of Samson, big, strong Samson. You know, we're taught because Samson wasn't a good dude. Even the heroes in Judges are rough. And in the middle of that, here's Boaz showing that you can do it. We can live lives of intentionality, following Christ in the middle of difficulty. And it reminds us that God is always there, even when you don't see him. But there's one last part here. God works through the righteous acts of his people to bless those around. What you see through Boaz is just doing stuff right. And Boaz didn't just show up doing stuff right. He'd been doing stuff right a long time. This is the life he lives. And now, who is God working through to change the area? It's through him. Church, if you've been a Christian long, realize the way that you live matters. The choices you make matter. Being a person of integrity matters. Because even though you think, well, I'm just making this choice because it seems to be the right thing. No, by making that choice, you make yourself available to work towards God's purposes. And it's through the church, so to speak here, through Boaz, that God does his work. What a great picture. But he's not the only one here. Now, Ruth is a part of this, although she hadn't talked yet, but it seems like we ought to pause and take a peek at her for just a moment as well, because Ruth's story is amazing. It's a story of reversal. Remember, she's the girl from that place. She's the one from that background. The racism that exists between the Moabites and the Jews was incredible. And here now, everything is different. When she placed her hands into the hands of God, remember when that great scene when her and Naomi are gonna come back. Orpah takes off, and Ruth says, "Where you go, I go. Where you live, I live. Where you die, I'm gonna die. Your God, Yahweh, will be my God." And she makes this great oath in that. In the moment that she begins to place her life into the hands of Yahweh God. I keep using this name Yahweh. If you haven't been around the church or you're new to this, the Old Testament name that God gives for himself is Yahweh. When we get to the New Testament, we see him in the person of Jesus, which means that Yahweh saves. The moment she begins to place her hands into that, everything changes. Her story is absorbed in his. Her past, her background, her story is overwhelmed by his goodness. Think of it this way. If there were a very poor gal who married think she's got debt, she's got struggle, she's got this, who ends up marrying a prince, what happens? Her debt is washed away. Her past is washed away. Her name is overwhelmed by his, and her future is very, very different. That's the picture. That's the picture. When we come to God, our past is overwhelmed by his goodness. This is a great reversal in stories. And what do the people say? I think that's what's really interesting. What do the people say? They say, "May your house be blessed, Boaz. Bless this gal that comes in here. And may your house, may she be like Rachel and Leah." Well, those were Jacob's wives. Those are the matriarchs of the whole nation of Israel. Saying, may she be one of them. Are you kidding me? A gal from this background? And they lift her up into that and say, "No. Not now. Let her be one of them." What an amazing story. Get this. I don't care where you've been, and I don't care what you've been through or what choices you've made. When you come to Jesus, your story is overwhelmed by his goodness. Your sin is washed out by his blood. And your future is secured because he's on the throne and he owns every minute of all of history. That's this picture. Ruth becomes a picture of hope for all of us. Look at verse 13, though. Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And he slept with her, and the Lord granted conception to her, and she gave birth to a son. Pause for a second. Not according to Naomi's harebrained schemes. not by when the passions run high, but according to righteousness, when the right choices were made at the right time. God blesses them with this son. Now, don't miss this. You go, well, yeah, they had a baby, big deal. She'd already been married for 10 years before. She'd been married for 10 years, but now God at work does something spectacular. Look at verse 14, though. Women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you without a family redeemer today. May his name be well known in Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. Indeed, your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Naomi took the child and placed him on her lap, and she became a mother to him. Think of it, she became a nanny. She became a mother to him. And the neighbor women said, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. You see, when we see Naomi's story here, we see another reversal. Remember, she starts off this whole thing saying, "El Shaddai attacked me." That's the name there. And those of you who were around in the 80s, we sang that song, El Shaddai, 10,077 times. We sang it until no one wanted to sing it anymore. But the point is this, is El Shaddai is the name that God gave when he said, "I'll give you children. I'll provide for you." And now she turns it around and says, "El Shaddai attacked me. He took away everything from me. I went away full, came back empty." But now there's this reversal, and it starts when she begins to head back to God. And she returns, but think of this, even in spite of her self-serving motives, in spite of the fact what she said about God, in spite of her harebrained ideas, God has been good. Amen. God has been consistently good in her life. His love, his commitment, his goodness, they never fail. They never stop. And Naomi's story is a story that repeats itself over and over and over and over. We see it over and over, the way that God works. Life doesn't go as we expect. Hurt is deeper and more painful than we think it's going to be. And what happens is we grow bitter. But everything changes for Naomi when she takes that step back towards God. All she has to do is start her way back towards God, and everything starts to change. Now, it's not what she expected, but it's 10,000 times better. And the women look at Naomi, and they sing praises of the ways that God has blessed her. God didn't leave you without a redeemer. God's providing for you. He left you Ruth, and she's better than 10 sons. And now this grandson who will indeed be the grandfather of no less than King David himself, the greatest earthly king that Israel ever knew. What a story. I wonder how many of us, life has sort of sidelined us with the pains and the struggles, the hurt. It's a little deeper, a little more painful than what we thought. And we can grow bitter, can't we? We can grow calloused. I'm here to tell you there's hope. It's by heading back. Heading back, coming back to be with your church family, to be with the support system that God has built around you, to see that God really is providing. And you know what? God's not a God that says, "I told you so." But then the author wraps this up in the oddest way. In the oddest way. You'd think he'd say something like Ruth and Boaz lived happily ever after. But he doesn't. He says, now these are the family records of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. And Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David. These last four verses, get this, give you the whole purpose of the book of Ruth. This is what the entire book is all about. When everything seemed dark, God hadn't forgotten his plan. When everything seemed messed up, God had, remember Genesis 49:10, he said the scepter will never, ever leave the hand of Judah. God hadn't stopped that. And he's still leading back. He's still bringing back to David because he's not about to change his mind. And honestly, if you think about it, Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, they have very different storylines, but together they all come together into one beautiful story that's all about what God's doing. Now, these verses here are just a portion of it. You'll get the rest of it when you go to Matthew. And he continues that. Because David had Solomon, and Solomon had Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, and it goes on and on. 14 generations to the exile, and then 14 generations to Jesus. God has always been working about bringing Jesus. Even then, he was preparing the way. And now we live on this side of Christmas, right? So we know that what he's doing now is still using the church to bring people to Jesus. To bring people to Jesus so that you and I aren't alone. So that we have a hope in the middle of difficulty. If you've got your communion elements, would you go ahead and grab them? You know, if you're like me, I mean, I think I was born about 10 minutes before the church service and have been at church services basically all my life ever since. You can go to this each week and almost take it casually, almost receive it just like it's not the best news in the world. When you and I come to communion, there's two elements, a piece of bread and a juice. And what they do is they say this. They say you're not alone. When it's dark, you've got hope. When things are terrible, God's still in control. And what it does, it points us both backwards and forwards and sideways, and I'll explain that. Points us back to a life that was lived on our behalf. That's the bread. The juice takes us to the cross, and it reminds us that there was a price that was paid. It was death on our behalf. And it forces us, remember that this isn't a between me and God alone, this is between us and God. It points us to the side and says, I'm with you. And you and I are together. And we're a family that has a hope. Boy, that's reason to be thankful. Would you pray with me? Father, as we receive your good news today, be exalted, Lord. Work in our hearts. Whether we may be like Ruth or Naomi or Boaz or a mixture of it, just remind us of how much you love us and the price that you've paid and the hope that we have. Father, forgive us when we're not the most thankful people on the planet. We should be. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.